So welcome to week 3 of Church in the Round. This week we're moving on to the part of the Lord's Prayer that says, "Give us this day our daily bread." And we'll be talking about prayer as honesty about our needs and desires. So Matt, tell us about this theme, prayer as honesty about our needs and desires. What does that mean?
Well, this is the part of the prayer that gets at a basic human need. Give us this day our daily bread, and the verbs there are present tense, which has a sense of keep on doing this. It recognizes this is an ongoing way of our dependence on God. I don't think often about where my food comes from. That's probably a dimension of my own privilege and my urban, suburban background. But this part of the prayer, I think, is more than just a simple piety of, thank you for the food and the hands that prepared it, but it's recognizing our dependence on God, even our dependence on one another, especially in our economy where I can afford to not know where my food comes from. But the question of needs and desires then becomes, what's the line between those, and what does it mean to be honest? Because a lot of the things I desire, I think I need, or I've conditioned myself to believe that I need. And what is a true need? There's maybe no need more basic than food and water or shelter, and so that I don't start to use prayer as a chance to advance my agenda or just to list all of the ways in which I wish my life were more comfortable. But also then to be focused on the needs of my neighbor. And so what does that look like when we pray this in a congregational setting, when I don't know the needs of the person in the next pew perhaps, but to be engaged in that and to think about how might I know what the needs of my neighbor are and be attentive to those and pray for God to be attentive to those.
Right. Give us this day our daily bread, not just to give me this day my daily bread. It's again that sort of individual and collective kind of dynamic. Yeah. Yep.
So I don't know, there's an honesty in the sense of maybe to pray that part of the prayer with integrity requires a step back out of the rush of daily life and say, what do I really need to get through this day? And so those are different every day, and I'm not trying to diminish other needs, but I think prayer is an opportunity to help us sort some of that out or reflect on that.
Yeah. To not just sort of go unexamined through our day or have our day be only informed by the messages of commercials. And I'm thinking about the Super Bowl commercials last night and everything that that they're doing to set up our needs and desires. I suppose the Super Bowl was last night for us, but for you folks, it probably
several
wasn't
weeks
last
ago.
Night. Yeah, several weeks ago, yeah. So I think we should talk in our conversation today about one of the readings that we've given you all, which is the reading of the parable of the rich fool. This is going to be the text that Tim preaches on, and my sense is that Tim's intention is to go to more of an economic justice angle. But I think we should talk about the rich fool in terms of this question of honesty about one's needs and desires. It's a really interesting parable. I will say, side note, this was the occasion when I first met Matt Skinner. I had to write a paper for him to critique about the parable for the rich fool, the parable of the rich fool. I'm in a preaching group called the Movable Feast, and it was my first year with the group, so I was very nervous about showing up with this academic paper in hand. You were very gracious about it, but we've had this conversation before. Maybe it was a good paper.
Yeah,
Who knows?
That's
Who
possible
knows?
too.
Yeah. But what do we think about this parable? There's a lot going on in it, so let's kind of unpack it.
Well, it's got one character.
Yeah.
And he's a negative character. He's a fool. He's called a fool in this. The question of what does he do wrong, or what is he lacking, is a really interesting one, because it's not his fault necessarily. There's nothing wrong that his crops produce enormously. It might not even be wrong that he wants to save that in a part of the world that knows famine and food shortages. But what I am always drawn to is his speech, his inner monologue, which is all about I and me. It's he's constructed a world where nobody else seems to come across his attention span, and his blessing is for him and him alone. And I don't know if I don't want to necessarily name that as like evil, or maybe it is sinful, but it certainly is foolish, because it misunderstands, I think, generosity misunderstands wealth and blessing, and maybe misunderstands where his blessings came from in the first place. And but
Yeah.
tell us what you said in your paper.
Oh, I don't remember what I said in my paper. I think, well, no, actually.
This was, I think, 3 or 4 years ago.
3 or 4 years ago, yeah. It was pre-pandemic, so hard
We've
to
all
remember.
forgotten that life.
I remember noticing that sort of first person singular of the prayer, the I and the me, of the pronouns in the prayer. And that has to do with how this rich fool character relates to neighbors. But I remember focusing also on how this rich fool character relates to time and relates to God. And so this part of it is the presumption that he is the only character in the world, or the only character in the story, the only person who could possibly have need of this grain that he's amassed. The other part is the assumption that the future is his to control, right? That his life will go on as it has, and that there's there's not an acknowledgement that things beyond his control may happen. He thinks that now that he has this abundant stash of grain, it's his to enjoy forever. And although I think it's sort of cruel to think of a God who would then teach him a lesson by stealing the rest of that future away, I think part of what this parable and its context emphasizes is sort of this ongoing dependence on God. Not just, okay, God has blessed me and now I don't need God anymore, right? But this sort of ongoing dependence on God in our lives. And I think I remember focusing on that aspect of the parable a little bit more.
Yeah. And dependence is, it's the kind of thing we often say, well, it's good for me to recognize this, but it doesn't come often. But honesty for me is the hard part of really recognizing my dependence.
Yeah.
Partly because of how we've constructed our culture, and partly because of the ways I circulate in this culture. But I'm reminded, and again, this is where I was really helped by the readings, the entries in the devotional that we're hoping people will read this upcoming week, that somehow reminded me collectively that honesty is something we grow into. I can't flip a switch and go from utterly dishonest to utterly honest, especially when I'm thinking about myself and assessing myself and my life and my merits or demerits or whatever, and trying to see myself in a clear mirror. That's always a process, and I think that's helpful to embrace it as a process and to recognize it's part of growth and maturity, I think. And also recognize that we're always telling lies to ourselves.
Sure, yeah.
That take us in other directions,
yeah.
too.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I do think that prayer can be a helpful tool with that, because it's an occasion to sit with oneself. And it's entirely possible to go through life without really doing that, and I think that just sort of repeated exposure, that even if, and I'm sure many of my prayers contain self-deceptions. I'm sure that's what God is hearing from us all the time. But there is that idea of growth through practice, and I love what you said about it not being an on-off switch, but rather a kind of lifelong process. Well, so we want to open it up now for your discussion. What does this part of prayer mean to you? Thank you for being with us this week.